Okay, I believe we're recording. Okay, not a bad showing. Great, thanks for all being here. And so, so before we get into today with this idea of systems and us, so we're getting back into Donella Meadows. A couple of things I want to point out. So, well, two things I want to point out. First one, Julia asked me to reiterate kind of how to go about responding to the discussion replies. And I know that they are listed as three separate questions, three separate inquiries, if you will, to the different posts or the different readings for each module. But we do want you to try your best to not just reply to each one by themselves, as in like answer for this one, answer for this one, answer for this one, all within the same discussion. We want you to try and weave them together. So even though they're presented initially separately, do your best that you can to kind of have one threaded together response of the three prompts. It is a bit of a challenge, but we want you to not treat them as three separate ideas, but to kind of like weave them in together, flow into them as one reply. Julia says that maybe about 5 or 6 of you are actively doing that, but then the rest are, you all treat it as 3 separate things. So try and weave them all together as in one as you can. Okay. So the second one is actually introducing the book reply. I'm actually not going to share a different screen here with you in a second. Let's see. Bring it back. Dude. New share. All right, so I'm going to share a different screen here. If we get into module 6, can you all see me going through our Canvas class? Can anyone confirm that?
Yep.
All right, perfect. Okay. So going down into area 8. So just to give you an overview, well, let's go into readings and presentations. I did post the 2 lecture videos that I have, which would include this one, at least the first half. So this one's being broken up into 2 pieces since it's long. And then the other video I have is from a fellow, his name is Nuri. He was actually he assumed the postdoc position before I had it a few years back. And so this is the lone video really from him. He also taught the course a few years back. So you can watch them if you want. Again, we'll have these classes as well. But the thing I really want to focus on is actually the next major assignment you have to take us throughout the semester. And so it's going to be this, again, kind of more iterative, one submission and another submission that kind of is a more beefed up version. But basically, this is the book network mapping project. And so the vision is that you're going to have a network map that essentially maps out and connects the books. So as you have seen, the books themselves do have a good amount of overlap. They'll talk about resiliency, they'll talk about systems, they'll talk about networks, whatever. But then they also do their own thing. Obviously resiliency is Walker and Salt. You'll get way more about complexity with Mitchell and so forth, some more of the computation components. And in thinking systems, they'll do a lot more with like feedback loops and so forth. So basically what we want you to do, at least for this one, is an initial sketch. So what we want you to do is to start identifying those individual parts. And so just give us a rough idea of, one, the parts you identified. This is literally you being able to just like write out as many separate ideas that you can think of that have been covered in the books. So, before we start thinking about relationships or edges or a topic or issue you want to attribute your map to, which we may actually strike out that last thing just to make it simpler. still thinking about that. But we just want you to think about all the different concepts that have been covered so far in this class. So right now, you're going to be coming up with a rough draft of a network map. You can type it. You can get into one of the visual mapping programs that are in the resources page. Basically, the immediate goal is to identify like a who said what in terms of individual concepts. And for our 4 identified readings, Cabrera, Meadows, Mitchell, Walker. Easy ones, obviously, feedback loops, diversity, information, goals, resiliency, that sort of thing. I mean, we've literally covered hundreds of different ideas in this class. So if there is a concept, just write it out and identify which author is the one who brought it up. Or if you know that both authors talked about it, write both of their names. Just literally just sketch. Don't go crazy into how they discussed it. I don't want the context just yet. Just basically a what and a who. Who said what? You can start rocking like a 4-circle Venn diagram if you want to then start organizing it. That might actually be a better means of doing that. When we grade this, it's going to be an all or nothing. So just give it some decent effort. You know, this, I think it's 30 points. And so, you know, whatever it is, a website URL, if you take us to a thing that you've been working on, say like a lucid chart in Google could be something. If it is separate upload, like a PDF, or even a text entry box, if you're just writing out as a list. Right now, we're looking at a due date of April 14th, so you have a week to work on this. But really, it's just listing out the parts. I don't want you don't have to go into visual mapping just yet. That's going to be for the next thing. But basically, the major takeaway from this is that this is going to be your primary, well, how we had it before, and I don't want to take this away from you, but it's going to be the primary resource you have during your final. The goal was that whatever this map ended up being for yourself was going to be your quote-unquote cheat sheet during the final exam. Obviously, you know, we're going to have a bit more of an honor code when it comes to this resource being available for you during the final. But basically, this was the one thing that we wanted to have that you gave yourself, essentially, for the final exam as a resource. So to whatever depth you go into it, not only does it serve as a standalone grade, both this initial SketchUp and then your final submission, but then also it's as a resource for your final exam. All right. So any questions on that one? I see a chat. I have a beautiful tab collection, very impressive. Thanks, Serena. It's maddening, actually. It's my entire life. Like, here's my personal as well. Oh, you can't see it, but it's even more. Okay. This is a good day too. Okay, so I'm gonna get back to the can it be a handwritten Venn diagram? This one, yes. I'm not. If it's just for you to get by, and then you'll eventually say translate your handwritten Venn diagram into a digital network map, totally cool. Just you can get a big piece of notebook paper, draw it out, do whatever, take a picture of it like as a JPEG. And then upload that into this this assignment. Totally cool.
And then for people who like maybe having trouble conceptualizing this, usually I think last year after class, a couple students stayed and talked to me about this because it can be kind of tricky to wrap your head around. So I do have office hours at 10:30 today, reminder. So I'm happy to help with that if this is confusing.
Perfect. Yeah, take advantage of it. Does it have to be a Venn diagram, or was that just an option? Totally just an option. This is literally just for you. We just want evidence that you have essentially thought of all the different parts that you want to start with. And this isn't even a complete list. You know, I actually I would hope that you add even more in between submitting this and your final work. I just thought that a quadruple Venn diagram for concentric circles would be a good way of starting to give you a heads up. But if you literally just want to write out a list, I'm more concerned with the parts right now. Just identifying what the parts are. And then we can start getting into relationships, edges, clusters, that sort of thing. Okay. Other questions? Moving on. Julia, while you were in the other room, I did ask them to be more cognizant of interweaving the discussion replies. So as opposed to just any, do you want to add anything more to that? I thought I kind of hammered it, but.
Yeah, so as you all have potentially noticed, I take off 3 points every time you don't weave things together. So even if you have great ideas, like the point, and like separately, the point of the post is to like begin to think in systems and write in systems and see how things interconnect. So all of you are like almost there, and a couple of you are getting it. But it would just like elevate your post so much and really show that you're synthesizing the material from each module. So do that, and then that also, yeah, it's just, I think they're more fun to write, and yeah, definitely shows that you're learning. So if you have questions about that, let me know too.
Quick question about the network mapping project. Yeah, you alluded to something about a visual being needed later. If we were to do this in a program for mapping everything, in order for that program to be helpful for the next stage, are there things that we're going to need to incorporate like visual or media in the next stage of this project?
No, there is not a media component to this one. I would not reject that. I think it'd be fun, but this is more about just a readable network map. You know, and you kind of saw from our last presentation, the VUCA one, with them, as Jacob, you saw, it was a big mess, right? A lot of overlapping edges and so forth, but there was kind of thematic clustering. And then remember, I actually showed the one that tried to talk about the obesity epidemic, and they did a network map for that one, and they were doing some better clustering of different things to consider. So you want to start going in, you're going to want to move in that direction eventually. But for this immediate purpose, no, you do not have to do a mapping platform. No, there is not a digital media embeddedness that I'm asking for. It's more of just going to be a nice, polished network map of you essentially laying out how all the different concepts in the books. Focus on the books for right now. Again, I'm leaning towards not having you, before in later class or in earlier classes I've done that you choose a social ecological problem to attribute to. It could be like poverty, it could be social justice, it could be climate change, it could be species conservation, whatever, renewable energy and so forth. It did get a little crowded, and I just think with everybody's undergoing a lot more stress, I think I'd rather you all just kind of focus on the books at this point. So I'm going to err on the side of not having you attribute the content to a issue per se. So, and Julia, I think we actually did that last year. Am I right or wrong on that one?
We didn't do an issue last year, which I think worked well, and like most students I think did it by hand for the most part, but then I think a couple of them that like really liked Plectica or other online mapping platforms, like they just really loved it during their mapping assignment. They used it for their exam. But I think, I forget, Andrew, if you had them like, because you can like take a screenshot of it, or if they were allowed to use the actual like interactive map. Like I think we'll figure that out later, but I know that like it just kind of depends on what engages you in the material the best way. And if like I'm totally a handwritten person, so like I would do this by hand, like that would just be what works for me. But like one student last year just loved the online platform, so like he did it that way, and like that's how his brain works. So it's about like you figuring out like how to look at what way you like to look at systems.
Yeah. And I mean, and just in light of everything, I would much prefer that we had, you know, these digital mapping platforms, because that's honestly where more of the field is. I mean, it's not so much that I want you to do it because I want you to do it. I want you to be comfortable with these types of network mapping and mind mapping platforms, because a lot of organizations and industries utilize these things to try and illustrate the complex problems that either their business or their nonprofit or whatever, you know, whatever the entity they work for, they use these online mapping platforms as a mechanisms to convey leaders and stakeholders, like why they should get money, why they should get attention, why they should get involved in their project. You can do a handwritten one for the sake of this, but you typically don't go to like a city council and present a hand-drawn network map relaying the problem like they do these digital platforms. And so I'd rather you go through it uncomfortably while we have this class, albeit everything crazy going on. Because if something you do end up using one of these things in, say, a sustainability solutions arena, you're like, oh, I've done this before. Okay, yeah. Or someone says, can someone like visualize this? And like, yeah, no, I've done a map before. I can take this on. I want you to be that person. So I would encourage you to utilize a digital platform. So basically, that's why I said early on with the campus mapping project, get in there as soon as you can digitally. If you do need paper at first, fine. The quicker you can translate it over to digital, the better. But if your brain needs to go straight to pen and paper, cool. I'm like that too. All right, I'm gonna get a move in into the presentation. So, all right, but yeah, if y'all have more questions, hit me up in the chat and we'll go from there. Okay. So I'll keep this, today doesn't need to be too terribly long. We've already gotten 20 minutes into everything. So this one is essentially Meadows, let's see, chapter 4, well, really chapter 3. It's the second half of the Meadows book. So it's the systems and us. So we're covering all of chapter 3 and then getting into the first part, if you will, of chapter 4, stopping at the end of page 94. So ending before non-existent boundaries. So a silly thought that I had also was, do you guys remember when I was talking about the fisheries off the coast of New England with a lot of fishermen that were competing against each other, and it was the fisheries that were taking a hit when more and more people were overfishing to the point where they couldn't reproduce? I thought about toilet paper as almost the exact same way as well. It just seems like, you know, toilet paper, be it a renewable resource, but also dependent on companies to remanufacture toilet paper. This idea of hoarding and this idea of racing against the capacity of one of these things to reproduce. So anyway, it was a poignant, sort of silly, but exactly spot on example of what else is going on. All right, so for today, why do systems work so well, and how and why do the systems surprise us? So this one, so as we start to get more into these last 3 weeks of instruction, this is where you're going to start seeing a lot more overlapping, a lot more points. And I think that's indicative of systems thinking, is that we ourselves are going to have a lot more feedback loops of thought. This is not meant to be a class where it's just a bunch of content to cover, like a lot of more topical classes. This is more about thinking about how we think and thinking about these patterns of thought that do repeat themselves, much like history, much like this pandemic we're going through. This is not the first time that we have gone through a pandemic. And it's amazing how many health officials have been decrying how we know that this is a problem, and why are we woefully underprepared for something like this again? You know, so we're not seeming to like learn what did people panic purchase in the past. Talk about alliteration in that sentence. So I don't know, a lot of the same things. Canned goods, a lot. I mean, probably toilet paper in the past. I don't know when eggs are flying off the shelves. They are. But if any of you have chickens, kudos to you. But that's a good question, Serena. Oh, and Serena and Ashley Culbertson, please make sure you post your discussion presentation. I meant to say that before. Okay. That'd be a fun little thing to research. So when it comes to resilience, there's always limits to it. And, you know, you're seeing a lot of resilience breaking points and tipping points at play right now in the world. We're starting to see New York's death cases plateau, reduce a little bit. So they might be starting to either get a hold of it, but now you're starting to see states that are really ramping up in terms of the cases that they're seeing. And so this idea of being able to adopt and withhold, you know, the number of ventilators, the number of hospital beds, the number of masks, that sort of thing. You know, these are resources that a health system has at its disposal to the point which it can reuse them, it can consume them, it can then acquire more and so forth. We talked about this in the past of a resource either knowing where to deplete, and manufacturers of all these respective things also trying to ramp up to meet this demand. What I thought was super interesting, I was listening to NPR on my drive yesterday, and they were chatting with the largest manufacturer of masks in the country. And they said, the CEO of the company said that the last time that they went through this during the swine flu, or the H1N1, that they were in the same position where all of a sudden they got tons of orders. They were making millions of these masks. They hired a bunch of people. They had a bunch of machines come in. They purchased a bunch more factory space. And then the virus came and went, and all of a sudden they were left with all of this infrastructure and hardware and employees. They laid off like 150, almost 200 people. They had all this space they couldn't afford the rent on anymore. So they had this enormous scale up for things, but then they almost went bankrupt when all that demand went away, and they were left with all this inventory and equipment. And so, you know, when we think about resilience, not just for the immediate, but then what is the resilience to then the aftermath and to the literal hardware, the actual infrastructure in which you've built yourself for resilience? Is that for a static moment in time, or is that going to be for a more persistent existence, if you will? So, I mean, the fact that you had this company that literally was making a piece of hardware, the mask that were going to save people, almost went bankrupt because of the very thing it was trying to help solve and resist. So, you know, resilience, the mechanisms of resilience, be it energy and material, not only do you need the stuff to resist a disturbance, but then there's the actual energy needed to then foster resilience, which can be taxing in of itself. So it's a double-edged sword, if you will. So it's just like, how much do you want to work out to be strong and healthy and have a good immune system to the point where you're not hanging out with friends, to the point where you're not actually getting work done? You know, people can be like exerciseaholics. You know, it's this mindfulness of what is the limits of resilience, as in how much it can resist, and then how much you have to put into it to foster and maintain resilience. You know, it's just a never-ending scope of consequence you have to be out for. So this other point here, systems need to be managed for not only stability and productivity, but also resilience. That's kind of get to it. You want the output, you want the system to do what it's intended to do, but then how well can we pivot? So just like our economy, it's been doing really well, but as you're seeing, it has not been a resilient economy. It's something where growth has been indicative, but it's been it doesn't have much depth, and it doesn't have much diversity. And so when it's just grow, and then something comes along and undercuts it, you've seen that, oh, this is not an economy that we can hang our hat on. This is not an economy that is poised to serve the many or is resistant to disturbances. This idea then of being aware of what that resilience is allows us to see how to preserve or enhance the system's restorative power. So ecosystem regeneration is a great example of this. The capacity for a forest to grow again, the capacity for grasslands to maintain soil quality and integrity, to make sure that biomes are healthy, or at least the microbiomes within a soil complex can regenerate, as opposed to just being dirt. It's something where you see this perpetuation of the foundation of what allows a ecosystem to resist disturbances. And, you know, for our sake as a species, we're obviously not seeing that with this virus. I mean, most people survive, most people, and actually great people never even become symptomatic. But this virus found a way to be incredibly contagious amongst our species, and then somewhat, I don't want to say the word praise, it's the virus is literally just trying to reproduce in itself. But it compromises those that are not resilient themselves, that have those underlying health issues, particularly respiratory issues. So folks who already have little resilience for their own individual body being, that's where you see individuals in the death toll taking advantage. Okay. So the number one thing, well, the number two thing I would say, the number one thing that fosters resiliency is diversity. But one of the biggest components that we don't want to talk about a lot is self-organization. We did mention this a little bit in a prior lecture, but it's the ability to be adaptive and evolve to a dynamic and changing environment by making its own structure more complex. So the more in which you become complex, this idea of organizing makes you more resilient. So this is a common property amongst living systems. So cells themselves can organize. This is what helps cells organize into tissues, which then, form specific organs, like a liver or a pancreas to a stomach. We start to coalesce in a certain way to then individual species, such as, humans to our pet dog, to then whole ecosystem. The term that has been thrown around as this idea is autopoiesis, a system capable of reproducing and maintaining itself. This is probably seen as the highest form and function of why systems work so well, as in when they're able to reproduce and maintain. So, when your parents had you became a self-standing you. Granted, your parents had to protect you and feed you and keep you warm and all that stuff. But essentially, like, you're on your own at that point. You get help, and we are a social species, but at the end of the day, we have to maintain ourselves. But you also have and you have the capacity to reproduce again. There are other examples of this, be it learning a language. Language itself is a means of organizing and discerning from a group to another. Mitosis, cellular replication. Community organizations is another great example of this. People that have, that have a crazy leader, and you have that first follower, that becomes an organization eventually. Cooperation defense. And so the picture you see behind the words is known as a bait ball, where you have a number of smaller, more inferior fish. You see the predator fish below. They form a complex organization where it's this dense ball, and it makes it really difficult for that fish to really pick off any one fish, because it doesn't need to chase one down. They're all just kind of became this mass. Our military is the exact same way. We could just be a bunch of yahoos with guns running around versus that of a really well organized military system, almost maybe too organized, as some would argue. Any questions at this point? I'll take a break there. What about self-aware rather than self-organizing? Good one. So, self-aware, I guess, is then the capacity really that yourself as a standalone entity, and you're like, okay, well, I am this. But then self-organizing, I think, is, being self-aware is more inward, if you will, whereas self-organizing is a more outward action. And this capacity to then know how to engage others, even like yourself as in other humans, to then coalescing and organizing in a way that perpetuates success. And so this idea of organizing, and we talked about this before, in that, to realize some of the change we seek and some of the issues that are coming on us. I mean, if we didn't have our healthcare system, if we had not organized at some point, you can be self-aware that you are susceptible to a virus. That's one thing. But then to come together with other individuals and understand materials to then put together a healthcare system, that itself is showing, oh, we can work on these things together to ensure success, mutual shared success, versus that of individuals, say, trying to foster and care within maybe an individual family unit. That itself is organizing, but it's at a much smaller scale with much less probability of surviving if, say, you have a very sick individual at home versus that of a healthcare system. We talked about, this idea of scaling up, a singular doctor coming to your home as you are in bed versus that of a fully functional hospital. That is that idea of scaling that we get to through this idea of organizing. But just knowing that you are susceptible would be a way of doing that. So is it more frequent that it changes? All right, is the more frequent that it changes and evolves to the environment circumstances make it more resilient? Good question. It can. However, to always be changing requires energy, requires time, oftentimes requires resources. And so if you're always looking at the state of the environment around you and then constantly changing yourself, the question is, how taxing is it for the individual, and how potentially depleting is that of the resources around you? So it gets to the point where, are you continuously shortchanging your goal, whatever it is that you actually want to do, and then changing yourself to be more resilient to the changing environment? So Kaylee, the question you're asking is really, what is this balance? So I would say no, that the frequency changes. It's more about being able to be generally resilient. So Kaylee, what you're saying is, if you are more specified resilient, what to what at all times, you can't sustain that. Itself is not sustainable. So, but then you have this generalized sustainability where you're just kind of like sweepingly resilient, but that kind of leaves you a bit more vulnerable to any specific thing. So again, this is this idea of balance and scale. If you want to get big, if you want to be more dependent on others, or you want to be more generalized, if you will, it might be less consuming for one individual. But if you're always changing, you should always be gradually changing, if you will. But I don't know, the idea of frequency, if you will, it's more of a gradual change. It's not this like consistent punctuated moments. So more slower gradual changes is better than not, which potentially could be better than more frequent changes, which could be too consuming to resources. Okay. And again, if you have more questions, by all means, just shoot them in the chat. Okay, so then we get to this idea of, oh wait, I skipped one. All right, so self-organization is the strongest form of resilience. So diversity is the strongest indicator of resilience. Self-organization is the strongest form of resilience. So you have this heterogeneity and unpredictability. So if you yourself stays as an individual, your individual patterns then become more predictable and could then potentially be more susceptible. So, as a virus, for instance, evolves to our pattern of being, or if we get complacent with our health system and we don't change up, same thing with our sanitary habits, we allow for viruses to then get it. Same thing, the argument could be done with our overdependency on antibiotics right now. By doing so and establishing a pattern of the use of antibiotics, it allows bacteria to become more resistant to our antibiotics. The more in which we frequently introduce them, not only into our bodies, but also into our water systems as well. So the more in which we become unpredictable to those threats, the harder the threats are to disrupt the way that we want to go. So this idea of heterogeneity, this idea that's essentially another means of diversity, this mix of whatever is our structure is, almost our genetic makeup, if you will, of not just our living beings, but our social beings too. So these few simple organizing principles can lead to a widely diverse of self-organizing structures. You can see the snowflake patterns as an example of this. It's funny how these simple patterns can lead to a greater complexity, if you will. I'm trying to get this chat window out of my way right here. Give me 1 second. Okay. It's funny, I see things that I know are not being shared. If you allow, so, not every hospital system is the exact same. Not every healthcare system is the exact same. They all do similar things, but when you allow for almost an evolutionary process of organization to take off, you can satisfy the mission, if you will, but do so in a way that allows for a disruption. So the emergency room example, not every place has an emergency room. So if emergency rooms get bombarded, for instance, there are other entities that could potentially accept people who are sick or in need of care, particularly right now. It's almost frowned upon to go to an emergency room if you're not suffering from COVID right now, but if you have other immediate health needs, you can go to other healthcare facilities that perhaps are not an emergency room or a hospital for that matter. So you have complex forms of self-organization may arise from simple organization or not. They could stay simple. So not everything needs to become complex. Evolution works this way. Like not every primate species became a human. Not every single cell bacteria became a megafauna mammal. There are perfectly functional self-organized entities that stay simple, and then some don't, and that's fine. That actually helps to the heterogeneity and unpredictability of why some things don't need to evolve, because the pressures, those particular populations don't have the pressures to change their environments and change their habits and behavior. So it's not across the board, it's not sweeping, but basically the takeaway here: some will get complex, some will stay simple. Some have predictive behavior, some don't. The more diversity there is, the less predictable they become, which then is harder for disturbances to attack them and change them. All right, questions? Okay. So in Meadows, they talk another thing that why systems work so well, and this can kind of be the bane of someone's existence if they're working in a very tight ship office setting, is hierarchy. And so, you have your boss, your boss's boss, your boss's boss's boss, that sort of thing. If you look to the little diagram on the left, anybody who's been an entry-level employee, you're one of those little dots at the bottom, and there's the CEO, the big dot at the top. There's a reason why these things do exist. Basically, they help with optimization, if you will. I know we've thrown that word around quite a bit, but to start, the hierarchy is essentially a system or an organization. It could be people, groups, or elements. They're essentially these subsystems. They're ranked in a way that are above one another according to status or authority or role. And if you wanted to kind of theorize, for instance, this could be an IT department on one, this could be a marketing department, this could be a community outreach department, maintenance and operations, blah, 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 blah. Like these exist everywhere in any type of almost work environment as well. These upper elements will have more authority compared to the lower elements, but they're, and the same thing would say this pyramid structure as well. But there is the reason behind this, and these last few points is why hierarchy can be good. Their purpose is to help originating subsystems do their jobs better. So it's the ability for these really more poignant, specific things to go. You know, like these top four up here, it could be a CEO and then could be vice presidents, whatever you down here. You know, they're not doing any one thing. They're really helping others do their job better. That is essentially the point of these things. If the subsystem's goals, as in the individual things that these smaller dots are working on, if they dominate the whole system, you will eventually get to this idea of sub-optimization, which is inefficient. You can't always be dependent upon any one thing doing their dominating the entire structure of the system. Otherwise, other parts of the system will be compromised. But I love this last point here. The hierarchy should evolve from the bottom up. Almost in a way, what you could do is turn this whole image upside down. I think that might probably be a wiser way of looking at this, is that all these individual workers here, they are the company, if you will. They are the ones that make it go. Just like ASU, you know, Michael Crow is obviously seen as a figurehead. He is this huge dot up here. But ASU is absolutely nothing without the students. You know, all of you doing your best. It is that collective effort of all the little dots doing their job that essentially makes everything happen. And so as students evolve, you know, as students do more distance learning, as students work more during their stay as a student, as students demand XYZ, or there's changes in majors, if you will, a demand for majors, like that's going to influence the entire, all the other dots above. Essentially the wants and needs and the capacities of the smaller dots. So hierarchies will usually evolve from the bottom up. When it's top down, it's not as resilient when you have one individual making choices versus the collective voices or actions of the smaller dots as well. And that'll force the whole organization to evolve on greater terms, which is nice. Thanks. Okay, any questions with hierarchy there? A lot of times it is top down, which then can create resentment and resistance, versus if it's bottom up and you have a top levels that are warm to those changes, it can help. Questions?
Just a quick question. You know of any local companies in Phoenix that have more of like a heliocentric ethos, or like a bottom-up design that's organizing, like what you're talking
about? Ooh. Well, there are some. There are a couple of big names that I think about. For instance, Intel, it comes to mind. You know, they do a lot of welcome innovation from lower departments. You know, they kind of have something similar to Google, where they allow for teams to be innovative, to try out different things. And so, you know, that spurs a lot of innovation that can then help the whole company as a whole. You do have a lot of startups in the area. You know, ASU does a good amount of this as well. You know, one of the really strong things that Crow does is this idea of empowerment to smaller colleges and smaller departments and smaller research entities to do their thing. You know, his mandate as one of the top-down orders was this idea of entrepreneurship, and that rubbed a lot of classical academics the wrong way. But what that then did was that it really helped to empower a lot of the other smaller labs and smaller either colleges or departments to start doing really interesting, innovative work. And so you can see some of these, and you can then see essentially some, you know, the cursor here, some of these entities might start falling behind because they don't take that type of initiative because they're used to, say, a more top-down approach. Or you start seeing, say, a director that's more encouraging of these smaller, say, entry-level workers and their immediate managers to be more innovative and do their own thing. And be like, hey, you know, how can I support you? How can I help you? That sort of thing, as opposed to always just iterating or giving top-down commands. As far as other entities further in the Phoenix area, yeah, the startup culture in downtown Phoenix, I think quite a bit about, but, you know, that's kind of startups in general. These more formalized, bigger companies, like, I don't know about GoDaddy or Tuft and Needle is growing really rapidly at this point. You know, you have the big other ones like Freeport McMoRan as well. So Intel was the first one that came to my mind. Yeah, so it's a good question, Jacob. I would need to learn more about that, honestly. Ashley, you're asking me, do you think that the U.S. government is a top-down hierarchy or bottom-up? Is it supposed to be bottom-up? It is supposed to be bottom-up, but I think there is an argument that it is switching to more top-down. I mean, that you're essentially talking about more of an authoritarian government with a leader that really wants to have more of a CEO approach, where you have a lot more of a top-down, I say this, I fire whoever. You know, you have other governments where the idea was there is an executive per se, but there's also a lot of checks and balances. And, you know, and even Obama and a little bit of Bush, you know, with this idea of the rise of the executive order should be concerning. But that was also because of more dysfunctional Congresses as well. So the idea of the Congress, representatives and senators, was supposed to have more of that decentralized back and forth. But as you got more partisan pull to either end of the political spectrum, you know, that created a void of leadership, essentially. And then you have seen more of this singular entity of an executive, in this case, the president, issuing more executive orders to circumvent what was supposed to be that decentralized decision making. So the dysfunction of Congress made that void / unfortunate opportunity to become more top down with an elected leader that embraced that idea of a more authoritarian decision making. But you know, you think about the cabinet, you think about all the different departments, you think about the states in general. You know, you do have all these other mechanisms at play, so it's not all on one person's literal desk. But it's gone a bit more in that direction. So it really depends on how much a president can then empower individual departments and states to take on. But, you know, right now, for instance, with Trump's approach of saying states should be more or less doing what they want to do in response to the COVID epidemic, but at the same time, states have been so crushed in terms of not generating, you know, not charging taxes on things. That means they have not been able to purchase a lot of these things, or if they have been, or other material for that matter. So states have been left out to dry in a lot of ways, based off of a lack of federal response. But I think is that Ashley's boyfriend? Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, so it's
sitting here with me and he wanted to ask a question.
Oh, that's funny. That's awesome. I just realized I saw the BF component right there. You have the idea of a democracy is supposed to be this bottom-up approach, but then the notion of an elected leader, that was the great design, if you will, from the founding fathers. It was supposed to be sort of this two-way street. You know, hence the importance of term limits, hence the importance of turning over. You know, it's not a king, it's not, you know, that's where that comes into play. We vote someone who has a limited timeline. So it creates that back and forth. But what that person does in that duration, you know, that's on them. Okay. I do not, yeah, so it's this one. And then I'm gonna actually pause, or I'll stop today after this next one. So the why systems work so well was this first part. The second part now is this why systems surprise us. And we're gonna pick up on Thursday into the latter parts of these things to consider. So systems themselves are meant to inform us about how the world works. However, everything we think, we know about the world is just a model. Even literally, how you think, what you know, what your parents told you, what the hell I tell you, everything that we do at ASU or what you have been seeing on Facebook. Those are just models. Those have all been information that has been absorbed by somebody, interpreted in a brain that has been beaten to hell by their lived reality for however long, and is then regurgitated in some way to inform a practice. That is a modeling. That is a representation of something. You know, even you looking at a sunset, the way in which you process that information is essentially going through some sort of filter, a brain filter that you have. Some person, you can think of sunset as wildly beautiful, and another person next to you can be like, that's neat. So for the most part, these models, these ways in which we interpret information, they have strong congruence with the world. As in there's a correlation, they're pretty much on point, but they will always fall far short of representing the entirety of the world. So all of the information, all of the data, all of the everything that exists in the world, you, your brain, and your five senses can only take in so much. So you're missing a lot. And what you do get is already getting compromised by the way you think about it. It's kind of a wild way to look at, I mean, it's a very philosophical kind of approach, but literally the questions you ask, the questions you don't ask, your privilege, your challenges, all of that affects how you take in information. And so when you think about the systems that we work within and your interpretation of them, they're already compromised, if you will. So therefore falling short of true, accurate representation, which is fine. That's the spice of life. So like, it's just being more, having humility with that. So these things that we're going to consider, this idea of beguiling events, linear minds, the nonlinear world, non-existent boundaries, layers, we'll get to these. So the one I'm actually probably going to, I might end on this one actually. So beguiling events. No, I do need to end on linear minds. So for beguiling events, you know, we get consumed with singular events, singular moments, you know, even a singular thing, as in like climate change is a lot of things happening on various timelines. Most people aren't really able to wrap their head around that, so they don't, and therefore they can deny it, if you will. Or if you just say yes to all of it, then everything is climate change. Versus this COVID virus, it's a very singular thing that we can point at. Granted, there's a ton of other elements to it that are complex, but it's a one singular thing that that is a thing I need to be scared of. That is a thing that I will convince myself and other people to stay in our homes all day, every day. So be it a singular thing or a singular event. You know, for instance, like with 9/11 being another major example, that was a singular event of terrorism, of foreign terrorism on domestic soil. You know, otherwise, almost every other terrorism event has been from homegrown terrorists. But we get consumed by this one thing. And so we even use that as an excuse to invade other countries. And with that, they're often emotional. They're topics of most conversation. My God, listening to NPR, 97% of everything has to do with this one thing right now. So we tend to see things in a black box, if you will, rather than an interconnected set of mechanisms. As in, there's this one thing that's in a black box. We know it's in there. It's hard to see, but it's consuming. And so we're fascinated by singular event. You know, or one thing happened. I don't know if anybody has this, but like, for instance, one thing has happened in your family or with your parent, and then every single decision they ever made ever again had to do with this one event that ever happened in their life. I don't know if anybody have had an example of that. My mom, I remember, would never, what was it? Yeah, I remember she like just had she got a vegetarian meal once and it was terrible. And then she just associated every single other vegetarian meal ever would be awful. And then when I was in a vegetarian kick, it was impossible to try and have a vegetarian meal at home because she thought they were all terrible. I'm like, it's a different way of making vegetables. I don't understand the problem. But yeah, she had that singular one moment where it was ruined forever. Oh man, that was dumb. Anyway, I digress. So yeah, we tend to get consumed by singular things. And then this will be the last one to wrap on here. We oftentimes foster linear minds in a nonlinear world. So truth be told, we're not very skilled or even that well equipped to understand the nature of nonlinear relationships. But obviously the world is full of nonlinearities. If this, then that. We do that. So it goes hand in hand with singular events. If this event happens, then it will happen again if I'm presented with this. But we know that that's not true. But our brains tend to go in that direction anyway, and we make decisions and choices as such. Okay. I have now dehydrated myself from talking so much. All right. Any questions to wrap today? Cool. All right. So I recommend that you take advantage of Julia's offer for office hours. Good. So to, again, go through literally, you just take pen and paper, whatever, start sketching out your book map, if you will. Julia's been through this, so just holler. And now that I'm in Cincinnati and don't have to deal with moving an entire house worth of stuff and then drive rapidly across the country, I am way more available now, which is awesome. So not to mention I'm on mandatory quarantine from the state of Ohio. So, woo. Who knows if I even have it or not, but such is life. Say la vie. So, all right. If that's it, holler. I have a couple discussion grades I need to catch up on, so that'll be one of my things up in the week. So, but Julia's been doing a great job of getting their discussions in. So keep at it. And again, if you need support at this time, do not hesitate to let us know. We will work with you the best that we can. I feel like we're being pretty fair in leniency at this point. We just want to make sure that you all succeed if given a genuine effort. So that's all we ask.
Yeah, on that note, I think the way, like, because I just graded 2 of your assignments, is if I'm still figuring out what's kind of like feels the best for grading. But if you like have reached out to us and told us that like you need extensions or help on something, then like we are being really lenient with late work. But kind of like what Andrew said a couple weeks ago, if you're not communicating with us at all, and like we're gonna assume everything is mostly fine. So if like you find that you're still turning things in late and you like it's because of extenuating circumstances, like let us know and we'll work with you. But otherwise, like I'll give you the benefit of the doubt as much as I can, but because ASU hasn't issued any like top down pass fail things or something like that, we're still trying to do things as business as usual as possible, since we don't want to like change our expectations too drastically. So does that make sense, Andrew, for everyone? Okay. So yeah, just make sure you're communicating with us, since that's when we can work with you the best. And if you have questions about any of your grades, like reach out to me, since like I don't know what's going on in your personal lives. So like I can't work with you unless you tell me what's going on and within reason.
All right. Well, good turnout today. Thanks all. Really appreciate it.
Okay.